Basically, anytime that you go to a web page and you are doing anything other than just reading the web page, you are interacting with a form. So when you go to do a Google search, or when you do any kind of e-commerce, or you participate in social media, or anytime you do really just about anything other than just viewing the web page, you are dealing with a form. And there are two parts to a form. There is the HTML part of it, which is the web page part of the form. That's the part of the form that you really actually see. And then there is the Common Gateway Interface part of the form, which is the computer script that processes the data that are found in the form. The way I like to think of this is that you remember back in grade school when the teacher handed you an exam and you filled out the answers to the exam, and then you handed the exam back to the teacher, and then the teacher graded the exam, and then after that you got the exam back and you looked at woohoo or crummy. Well, the form, that would be like the test that the teacher gave you. And the student filling out the answers to the form, that would be the visitor filling out all of the form fields on the form. And the teacher grading the form, that would be the Common Gateway Interface. That would be the computer script that processes the form. And then the student looking at the result, that would be the resultant page that comes after the data have been processed by the computer script. The good news is that you do not need to be a hardcore programmer or even really a very experienced programmer in order to use a forms processing script. The forms processing scripts are generally written in Perl or PHP or C or one of the other server-based computer programming languages. Python's another big one these days. And fortunately, there are lots of websites that are out there that have scripts available for you that you can just download and use. So I've put some of them up here on the slide. So GitHub, code.google.com, those are probably the most obvious examples of places where you can go to get scripts. If you want to learn how to become a programmer and actually have a better understanding of how this all works, I've included a couple of tutorials on both Perl and PHP that I think might be useful. But since this is a web page class, we're going to focus primarily on the HTML part of it. So the first part is the form element. The form element encloses the form itself, so all of the various different form fields and field types and other information that is found in the form is surrounded by the form and closing form tags. Primarily, you use the input tag to define variables and field types. So a variable is those things that are going to change. So in the analogy that I gave about the student exam, the answers to the questions would be a variable, the student name would be a variable, so student's first name, student's last name, today's date, answer to question 1, answer to question 2, all of those would be the variables. In HTML, the various input types that exist are input type equals text, input type equals password, input type equals radio, input type equals checkbox, input type equals reset, input type equals submit, input type equals button, and input type equals hidden. In HTML5, there are a handful of other input types that exist. There's input type equals URL, where you can define it's a special kind of type equals text. It's for URLs, and it has the feature where if you use input type equals URL and the visitor goes to the website using a cell phone, then the on-screen keyboard will change to make it easier to type in a URL. If you are doing input type equals email, it will change the keyboard to make it easier to fill in email addresses. So the @ symbol becomes more prominent and that kind of stuff. There are a couple of other elements that are used to put in variables and field types. Those would be text area, it's its own tag, as is select. Text area is used when you want to have a multi-line text box, so things like comments, or in the case of like Facebook, putting in the status update, or in the select tag is used to create primarily drop-down menus. Those are the primary parts to a HTML form. In the form tag, you need to put in two different attributes. The method attribute tells the form how, and the web browser, how the information is going to be sent from the web browser to the web server. And then the action tells the web browser where the data from the form are going to be sent. With the method, there are two different types of method. There's method equals get and method equals post. With method equals get, the data are sent to the computer script in the same time and with the same transaction that the request for the resultant web page is sent. So you may remember that you don't really go to web pages. What you do is in your web browser, you say that you want to go to, say, stanford.edu, and your browser makes a connection to the Stanford server, grabs a copy of that source code, and brings it down into your computer's cache. Well, the way that this information is sent using the get method. Now, as part of the get method, the data are placed at the end of the URL. So anytime that you use the get method in creating a form, you can always see what the variables are and what the data are for those variables. So in this example on the left, where we say a Google search for Stanford University, the variable there is the variable Q for query, and the value was Stanford plus University. Spaces are translated into either a plus sign or %20. On the right-hand side, you'll notice that there are two variables that are present. There is the variable Q for Stanford plus University, and the variable HL, referring to the language. And the value of that, instead of being EN for English, it is DE for German. And so this is then the German version of the Google search engine searching for the word Stanford University. The other form method is method equals post. With the post method, the data are sent to the computer script in a completely separate transaction from that of the request for the web page. So you'll notice that what this does is that rather than put the data and the variables up in the address bar, those variables and data are sent to the computer script in a completely separate transaction. So in this example, you'll see that nowhere in the URL does the member number appear in the address bar. If this were done using method equals get, it would have said something like memnum equals and then the member ID number. Generally, you want to use method equals get for web forms that are either search engines or act like search engines, so like e-commerce sites, where you might want to make it so that a visitor could highlight the URL, copy it, and then paste it into email, or paste it into a Facebook status, or tweet it, and make it easier for their friends to then go and find the same items. And generally you want to use method equals post for pretty much everything else. The somewhat unfortunate thing is that the default is method equals get. So unless you explicitly specify form method equals post, then what you will get is method equals get. Once the browser knows how the information is going to be sent, the next thing the form needs to know is where the information is going to be sent. And that is where the action attribute comes into play. So the value of the action attribute is going to be the location of wherever that computer script is located. In the case of Google, that's going to be at google.com/search. In the case of the Stanford Federal Credit Union, it's going to be logon.aspx inside of the sign-on folder on the d.sfcu.org web server. The form itself then is primarily consisted of input tags, which define the various different field types and the names of the variables. Those input tags allow the visitor to enter the information or to select the choices that the web developer desired. Every input tag is given a type and name attribute. These attributes determine the kind of information that the input tag contains, as well as the name of the variable for that form field. The most commonly found input type is input type equals text. What input type equals text does is it creates a single line text box for your user to place in data. You can set the size, the maximum length, and the default values if you wish. The syntax for it is input type equals text, name equals the variable name, size equals the size of it if you want to define the size of the box. This would be the number of characters that you want the box to be. Max length equals if you want to define the maximum number of characters that a visitor could type in. And value equals if you want to define a default value. So in the example below, the text box is going to say the text, or rather the label is going to say enter your first name, and then the text box is going to be input type equals text, name equals first name, size equals 40, max length equals 40, value equals enter first name. So by default, it will say enter first name, and if the visitor doesn't type in something other than enter first name, then when they hit the submit button, the value enter first name will be applied to the variable first name. Because we put in a max length of 40, the maximum number of characters that they could type in is 40 characters. And because we said size equals 40, the box is going to be 40 characters wide. Input type equals password is a very special type of input type equals text. And instead of it echoing back the same characters that you type in, what will be echoed to the screen are asterisks or dots instead of the text. Very important thing to realize, however, is that there is nothing secret or protective by using input type equals password. When the visitor hits the submit button, the data are sent to the computer script in exactly the same method that the data would have been sent in input type equals text. What makes the transaction safe is the fact that the visitor is using the HTTPS protocol to access the web content instead of the HTTP protocol, not the input type equals password. The fact that data or the numbers or letters are not showing up and instead asterisks are showing up does not indicate that the web site is safe to enter in your data. You need to make sure as a visitor and as a consumer that anytime you put in sensitive information like passwords or social security numbers or credit card numbers, that in addition to them using the input type equals password, that they are utilizing the HTTPS protocol and not the HTTP protocol. And you do that by looking at the browser's URL up in the URL box. Make sure it says HTTPS and that there's a little lock. Sometimes you'll want your visitor to be able to put in more data than just is capable for a single line text box. If you want to have a multi-line text box, this is done actually using a completely different tag. Instead of using the input tag, it is the text area tag. And so examples might be, in the case of social media, you might want to have a place for people to put in their status update or their Twitter post or anything where they want to be able to put in large amounts of information. Or in the case of a blog, you might want to have a comments section where people can type in their comments. To create this, it's done with the text area tag. And the required attribute for the text area would be text area name equals and then the variable name. Optional choices would be rows, defining the number of rows, calls, defining the number of columns, so how wide you want the text box to be, and wrap. If you turn wrapping off, it means that even though it's a text box, it will only allow one line of text. So it's kind of ridiculous with wrap equals off. Wrap equals soft, also known as wrap equals virtual, allows wrapping to happen, but what will happen is that the information will be sent then to the computer script as if it were one long line of text. With wrap equals hard, also known as wrap equals physical, the wrapping is going to be on, so when the visitor keeps typing and comes to the end of the line, it'll wrap to the next line. But when it gets sent to the computer script, it'll be sent with line breaks. It'll be as if the visitor really did hit enter every time they came to the edge of the box. Input type equals radio allows you to define a group of buttons from which only one may be chosen. The syntax for this is input type equals radio, name equals variable name, value equals, and then whatever you want the value to be. A really important thing to realize is that just because the label says something, that has no bearing on the fact that that's the information that gets sent to the computer script. So in this example here, it might look like the visitor is choosing between UCLA, Harvard, Oxford, or Stanford. But it turns out that if they select UCLA, Stanford gets a vote. They select Harvard, Stanford gets a vote. They select Oxford, Stanford gets a vote. And if they click Stanford, then Stanford gets a vote. And that's because in the code, it says input type equals radio, name equals UNIV, value equals Stanford for each of the radio buttons. So what is the label doesn't matter. What matters is what is in the actual HTML code for the input type equals radio. In this case, the variable name is UNIV. Another thing, you need to make sure that for every radio question, that you would need to have the same variable name. So it would need to be, in this case, name equals UNIV, value equals, and what should be UCLA. Name equals UNIV, value equals, and what should be Harvard. Name equals UNIV, value equals Oxford. Name equals UNIV, value equals Stanford. If you add the variable checked, then, or the attribute, I mean checked, then will be the default selected. Input type equals checkbox works just like the radio button, except that with input type equals checkbox, more than one value can be selected. The syntax for input type equals checkbox is input type equals checkbox, name equals the variable name, and then value equals and whatever the value should be. So in this example, just like with the previous example, just because the label says something, that doesn't mean that it's necessarily going to be sent to the script. So when the visitor selects Macintosh, the value is sent with the word MAC instead of Macintosh. When they select Windows 8, it gets sent as Win8 instead of Windows 8. Just like with the input type equals radio, if you want an item to be pre-selected, you can add the attribute checked. And just like with the radio, you should group all of the choices together with the same variable name. So in this case, variable name equals computer, the various different choices. You may need to set up an array with your computer script, depending on how the computer script processes multiple choices. So if you're doing PHP, for example, you might need to have as the variable computer bracket bracket instead of computer, or computer bracket 0 close bracket, something like that. But that is going to be specific to the computer script. By default, the select element will produce a list of choices as a pull-down menu. It is not an input tag, so it's not input type equals select. It is its own tag, select. And the syntax for the select element is select name equals and then the variable name. And then each item is demarcated by the option tag. And the option tag pair is option value equals and then whatever you want the value to be, and then whatever you want the text to say, and the close option. Just like with the radio buttons and the checkboxes, just because a label says something, that doesn't necessarily mean that's what's being sent to the script. So it would not be difficult. In fact, it would be quite easy if I wanted to create a drop-down menu called select name equals class hyphen enjoyment and have each of the options say option value equals great, I'm bored with this class, close option. Option value equals great, this class was great, close option. And what would happen is that everybody would look like they had selected that they thought the class was great. In addition to being able to do a drop-down menu, you can instead create what's called a list box. To do a list box, you put in the size attribute. So you say size equals and then the number of lines that you want to have present. In this case, we said size equals 2 for the 2 choices. If you add the attribute multiple to the select element, you can make it so that visitors can select more than one from a series of choices. It's been my experience that most visitors prefer to use checkboxes rather than the multiple from the select element. And it's been my experience that most people prefer to do the radio buttons rather than the list box from a choice. So usually when I'm creating a form and I want to have something from a series of choices, I'll either do it as a drop-down menu, in which case I'll use the select tag, or I'll use the radio button or checkbox, whichever is most appropriate. Input type equals reset allows you to create a push button that will reset and clear all the data fields to their default values. These days, most people realize that they can hit the reload button and kind of do the same thing, so we don't find the input type equals reset used that often anymore. Input type equals submit is used anytime that you want the data to be sent to the computer script for processing. So the way that the syntax is done for this is input type equals submit, value equals, and then whatever you want the push button to say. And when the visitor clicks that push button, all of the data they had filled out in the form will be sent to the computer script found in the action attribute using the method that was selected in the method attribute for the form tag. Sometimes, instead of creating a button that is a text button to do the submit, developers will want to use a picture to do the submit. So most common example of this would be on a search on a main website, so say on the Stanford University website. Instead of having words that say search, there is a picture of a magnifying glass. That's input type equals image. The syntax for input type equals image is input type equals image, src equals, and then the location of the picture, so the URL to the picture, alt equals the alternative text for that picture, and if you want to specify the width and the height and the border, you can specify the width, height, and border as well. Sometimes you'll want to create an action that is secondary to the primary action. So in the case of a mortgage form, you might want to, or a loan form, you might want to have as the main action, submit application. But as a secondary thing, you might want to have calculate interest to figure out what the interest is going to be. Or in the case of a e-commerce site, you might want to have calculate shipping. Or you might want to have, in the case of a webmail, you might want to have check spelling instead of send mail. So the main action would be to send the mail or to purchase the item or to submit the application, and that would be done with the input type equals submit. But the secondary action might be done using input type equals button and then tying that, that button to an event using a scripting language like JavaScript or a server-based scripting language like PHP in order to make the event occur. Perhaps the coolest thing that you can do in a form is to submit default or previously specified text that is hidden from the user. And the syntax for this is input type equals hidden, name equals the variable name, value equals, and then whatever the value is. The reason that this is cool is that it makes it so that the types of things that you like to do on the web these days can happen. So in the olden days, if I wanted to, say, send an email, what I would do is, if I were trying to do it on the web, is that I would go to my web browser and I would go to Gmail or whatever, and I'd put in my username and I'd put in my password and maybe my emails would appear. But if I tried to read one of those emails, the web browser would have already forgotten who I am. And that's because the way that the web servers and web browsers are built, they are built on an idea that every time you are interacting with it, it is a one-time situation only. So it doesn't remember that you were there. There is no consistent state, but we want that state to happen so that it does remember who you are. So that in the case without having input type equals hidden, what would happen is that I would go to my, I would go in and I would put in my username and I'd put in my password, and then it would show me the list of email, and then I would click onto that email and it would say, great, who are you again? And I would need to put in my username and password. With input type equals hidden, what happens is that the visitor logs in. So in this case, he logs in as John Doe with a password of 694. And then it comes back and it says, great, John, what would you like to buy? And John says, I want to buy 3 widgets, and hits enter. Unbeknownst to John, his username and password are sent back to the computer script so that the computer script receives that the part is widget, the quantity is 3, and then the name is John Doe, and the password is 694. None of this would be possible without the input type equals hidden, because without input type equals hidden, every time John wanted to buy something, he would need to put in his username and password and the thing he wanted to buy and the number of items that he wanted to buy. These days, people generally store hidden information like this in cookies or in local storage so that people don't have to keep writing in their usernames and passwords, and they can be then stored and cached in browsers. And in fact, generally speaking, you don't actually even put in the usernames and passwords. What you put instead is the session ID number, and then that session ID number is stored on the server and associated then with the usernames and passwords and credit card information and other types of secure information. And then that information is then what is actually sent. So the session ID number is what is generally sent using the input type equals hidden, as opposed to people's user passwords or credit card information. So here's another example of a form with many of the various different form fields selected. So on the left-hand side, the Facebook sign-up screen has input type equals text, input type equals password, and input type equals submit. And then below, in the sign-up part of it, it has input type equals text for first name, and input type equals text for last name, and input type equals password for password. The select drop-down menu is done with the select tag. The male and female is done with input type equals radio. And again, the sign up button is input type equals submit. Once you've signed into Facebook, then you have the post is created using the text area. So where you put in your status update is done with the text area tag. And the search field, the part where it says search Facebook, that would be input type equals text. And the little magnifying glass is input type equals image.